Chapter 3 Cast Off. Some 2 weeks later, or, to be exact, 16 days, making the date therefore, the 8th day of July, a round-faced, freckle-cheeked youth in a pair of khaki trousers, white rubber-soled shoes, a light flannel shirt that had once been brown and was now the color of much diluted coffee and a white duck has sat on the forward deck of a trim motorboat with his feet suspended above the untidy water of a slip. By turning his head slightly he could have looked across the sunlit surface of Buttermilk Channel to the green slopes of Governor's Island and, beyond the gleaming Statue of Liberty. But Perry Bush was far more interested in the approach that led from the noisy, granite-paved street behind a distant fence to the pier against which the boat was nestled. As he watched he sniffed gratefully of the mingled odors that came to him. The smell of salt water, of pitch and oakum, of paint from a neighboring craft receiving her summer dress, of fresh shavings and sawdust from the nearby shed whence came also the shriek of the bandsaw and the tap-tap of mallets. Bollinger's yacht basin was a busy place at this time of the year, and the slips were crowded with sailboats and motorboats, while many craft still stood, stilted and canvas-wrapped, in the shade of the long sheds. Perry whistled a gay tune softly as he basked there in the warm sunlight and awaited the arrival of the rest of the boat's crew. Much had happened since that Thursday when they had toasted the Adventure Club in Steve's and Joe's room in Sumner. Graduation day had sent them scurrying homeward. Then had followed much correspondence with Steve. After an anxious 4 days, Perry and the rest had each received a brief but highly satisfactory telegram, cockatoo hours for 2 months. Meet Bollinger's Basin, Brooklyn, 4th. But work on the cruiser had delayed the starting date, and they had now been kicking their heels about New York for 4 days. Perry and Phil Street had been taken care of by Steve, and Joe had Neil, Han and Aussie as his guests. At Bayshore, on the south side of Long Island, the Follow Me was awaiting them impatiently. The Follow Me had been ready to put to sea for a full week. Although Steve and Joe had provisioned the Cockatoo which, by the way, was no longer the Cockatoo, but the Adventurer, having been renamed during the process of painting, the crew had not been altogether idle during their wait. Each had thought of something further to add. Aussie, who, as a special favor, was to be allowed to try his hand at cooking, had made several trips between a big department store on Fulton Street and had returned to the basin laden each time with mysterious packages, many of which rattled or clinked when deposited in the galley. Perry had purchased an inexpensive talking machine and a dozen records. Neil had contributed a patent life preserver that looked like a waistcoat to be used by an Arctic explorer and was guaranteed to keep Barnum and Bailey's Fat Man afloat. Phil had supplied the cabin with magazines, few of them, to Perry's chagrin, of the sort anyone but a highbrow would care to tackle. Joe, as an afterthought, had stocked up heavily with Mother Somebody's cure for seasickness. George Hainford had tried to smuggle on board a black and white puppy about a foot long which he had bought on a street corner for $2.50. Steve, however, had objected strenuously and Han had been forced to see the puppy's former owner and sell his purchase back for $1, the value of it having decreased surprisingly in a few hours. Even Steve had supplemented the boat's contents the day before by stowing 2 desperate-looking revolvers and several boxes of cartridges in a locker in the forward cabin. Then too, they had each outfitted more or less elaborately, according to their pocket-books. Steve and Joe had pointed out that, with 7 aboard, locker room would be at a premium, and had urged the others to take as little in the way of personal luggage as they could get along with. But when the out-of-town boys got into the stores the advice was soon forgotten. Neil had outfitted as if he was about to set forth on a voyage around the world, and Han was not far behind him. Perry would have liked to become the proud possessor of some of the things the former fellows brought aboard, but Perry's finances were low after he had paid for that talking machine, and so, with the exception of a new gray sweater, he had made no additions to his wardrobe. This morning he had volunteered to go to the basin early and superintend the loading of ice and water, and now, those things aboard, he was wondering, a trifle resentfully, why the others didn't come. They were to cast off at 11 and it was now well after 10. Probably, he muttered, edging back so that he could have the support of the big, round smokestack, Neil's buying another necktie. It would serve them right if I started the thing up and went off without them. As, however, Perry knew absolutely nothing about a gasoline engine, there was little likelihood of his carrying that threat into action. In any case, there would have been no excuse, for less than a minute later he descried the tardy ones skirting the shed and coming along the wharf. They looked, Perry thought with satisfaction, very hot and disgruntled as, each carrying his belongings in a parcel so that there would be no bags to stow away, they approached the boat. Although Perry was no mechanician, he quite understood the operation of an electric horn, and now, swinging nimbly down to the bridge deck, he set the palm of his hand against a big black button. The result was all that he desired. An amazing, ear-splitting shriek broke the ordinary clamor of the scene. Perry smiled ecstatically and peered out and up from under the awning. But the half-dozen countenances that looked down at him expressed only disgust, and Joe's voice came to him even above the blast of the horn. "Don't be a silly fool, Perry!" shouted Joe peevishly. "Let that alone and catch these bundles." Perry obeyed and one by one the fellows scrambled from wharf to boat. and, having reached the bridge deck, they subsided exhaustedly onto the two cushioned seats or the gunwale. Perry viewed their inflamed, perspiring faces in smiling surprise. "What did you do?" he asked. "Run all the way? Joe got us on the wrong car," panted Neil, "and we went halfway to Coney Island, I guess." "It wasn't my fault any more than it was yours," growled Joe. "You had eyes, hadn't you?" "We had eyes," replied Aussie from behind his handkerchief, as he wiped his streaming face, "but we aren't supposed to know where these silly cars go to." "I didn't have any trouble," murmured Perry. "Well, we did," said Han resentfully. "We waited 10 minutes on a broiling hot corner and then, when we did get another car, it got blocked behind 10,000 drays and we had to foot it about 11 miles. Got any ice water aboard?" "We've got ice and we've got water," replied Perry. "If you mix them in the proper proportions, oh, dry up and blow away," muttered Han, dragging himself painfully down the companion on his way to the galley. Phil Street smiled. "Seems to me we're starting our adventure rather inauspiciously," he said. "If we have a grouch before we leave the dock, what's going to happen later?" "Maybe it's a good thing to have it now and get over it," laughed Steve. "It was hot, though. And it isn't much cooler here. Let's get underway, fellows, and find a breeze. It will take us the better part of 4 hours to get to Bayshore, anyway, and I telephoned Wink yesterday that we'd be there by 3. Every fellow into sea togs as quick as he can make it. Joe and Phil and I bunk aft, the rest of you in the main cabin. Get your things put away neatly, fellows. Anyone caught being disorderly will be keel-hauled. Have a look at this thermometer, Joe. It's almost 89. Let's get out of here in a hurry." For the next 10 minutes the fellows busied themselves as Steve had directed. All, that is, save Perry. As Perry was already dressed for sea, he used his leisure to sit in the hatchway of the after cabin and converse entertainingly with the occupants until, on the score that he was keeping the air out, he was driven up to the cockpit. There he perched himself in one of the 4 comfortable wicker chairs, placed his feet on the leather cushioned seat across the stern and languorously observed a less fortunate person scrape the deck of a sloop on the far side of the slip. Suppose that, while the Adventurer's crew prepares for service, we have a look over the boat. The Adventurer, late the Cockatoo, was a 40-foot V-bottom, military-type cruiser, with a 9-foot beam and a draft of 2 feet and 6 inches. Below the waterline she was painted a dark green. Above it she was freshly, immaculately white as to hull, while decks and smokestack were buff. The exterior bulkheads were of panelled mahogany, and a narrow strip of mahogany edged the deck. There was a refreshing lack of gold in sight, and, viewed from alongside, the Adventurer had a very businesslike appearance. As she was of the raised deck cabin type, with full headroom everywhere, she stood well above the water, and the low, sweeping lines that suggest speed were lacking. But the Adventurer had speed, nevertheless, for under the bridge deck was a 6-cylinder 6x6 Van Light engine that could send her along at 20 miles an hour when necessary. On the stern was the legend Adventurer, New York, and the name appeared again on each of the mahogany boards that housed the sidelights. The cockpit, which was self-bailing, was roomy enough to accommodate 7 persons comfortably. A broad leather-cushioned seat ran across the stern and there were 4 wicker chairs besides. Life preservers were ingeniously strapped under the chair seats and 2 others hung at each side of the after cabin door. The after cabin, or owner's stateroom, held 2 extension seats which at night were converted into wide and comfortable berths. At the forward end a lavatory occupied one side and a clothes locker the other. Other lockers occupied the space between the seats in the 3 ports. This compartment, like the main cabin, was enameled in cream white with mahogany trim. 3 steps led to the bridge deck, a roomy place which housed engine, steering wheel and all controls. The engine, although under deck, was readily accessible by means of sectional hatches. On the steering column were wheel, self-starter switch, spark, throttle and clutch, making it easily possible for one person to operate the boat if necessary. 2 seats were built against the after bulkhead, chart boxes flanked the forward hatchway and the binnacle was above the steering column. Forward, the compartment was glassed in, but on other sides khaki curtains were depended on in bad weather. When not in use the curtains rolled up to the edge of the awning, which was set on a pipe frame. From the bridge deck 3 steps led down to the main cabin. Here in the daytime were 2 longitudinal couches with high upholstered backs. At night the backs swung out and up to form berths, so that the compartment supplied sleeping accommodations for 4 persons. There were roomy lockers under the seats and at mealtimes an extension table made a miraculous appearance and seated 8. Forward of the main cabin was the galley, gleaming with white enamel and brass. It was fitted with a large ice chest, many lockers, a sink with running water, a 2-burner alcohol stove with oven and a multitude of plate racks. It was the lightest place in the boat, for, besides a light port on each side, it had as well a hatch overhead. The hatch, although watertight, was made to open for the admission of ice and supplies. Still forward, in the nose of the boat, was a large water tank and, beyond that, the rope locker. The gasoline tanks, of which there were 4, held 250 gallons. The boat was lighted by electricity in all parts by means of a generator and storage battery. An 8-foot tender rested on chocks atop the main cabin. The boat carried no signal mast, but flagpoles at bow and stern, and abaft the bridge deck frame held the Union Jack, the yacht ensign, and the club burgee. All in all, the Adventurer was a smart and finely pointed craft, and a capable one too. Steve's father had had her built only a little more than a year ago, and she had seen but scant service. In the inelegant but expressive phraseology of Perry, she was a rip-snorting corker of a boat. The consensus of opinion was to the effect that Mr. Chapman was a peach to let them have it, and there was an unuttered impression that that kind-hearted gentleman was taking awful chances. For, after all, except that Steve had had a brief week or so on the boat the preceding summer, and that Joe had taken 2 days of instruction in gasoline engine operation, not a member of the crew knew much of the work ahead. Still, George Hainford had operated a 12-foot motor dinghy at one time, Phil Street had sailed a knockabout, and all had an average amount of common sense, and it seemed that, with luck, they might somehow manage to escape death by drowning. Mr. Chapman surely must have had a good deal of faith in Steve and his companions, or he would never have consented to their operating the cruiser without the aid of a seasoned navigator. As for the boys themselves, they anticipated many difficulties and some hazards, but, with the confidence of youth, they expected to muddle through, and, as Neil said, what they didn't know now they soon would. At exactly 7 minutes past 11 by the ship's clock, the Adventurer gave a prolonged screech and, moorings cast off, edged her way out of the basin and dipped her nose in the laughing waters of the bay, embarked at last on a voyage that was destined to fully vindicate her